My fellow FIers, welcome back to another episode of Retirement Police Most Wanted, where we discuss financial independence and how you can achieve it. Today we are talking about Social Security. It was something my grandmother relied upon, as do millions of Americans. And also as it relates to baseball cards, because we are in the middle of Major League Baseball season. And for those of you who collect baseball cards, particularly those of you who may have collected Topps baseball cards back in the day, we're going to chat about that. Thanks for being here. Again, welcome back to another episode of Retirement Police Most Wanted. So today we're talking about one of my favorite people, and that is my grandmother. And even though she departed a long time ago, she really played an important role in my life. I'm sure many of you have grandparents that hopefully you had the good fortune to get to know them, and they impacted and created indelible money memories. I have a particular memory related to my grandmother as it pertains to Social Security and retirement and baseball cards. I will let you know that as a child, I had an inordinate amount of energy. My parents often needed a temporary break. I'm not sure if I'm the type of child that you can relate to if you have children and you often feel that you need a break from those high energy children. So enter a free and willing babysitter in the form of my grandmother. My maternal grandmother was amazing, and the situation was multi-beneficial. My parents were able to preserve their sanity over a weekend or a few days during the summer when I had a rare break in sports activities. That was a major activity for me. If you've listened to the show, you know that here at Retirement Police Most Wanted, HouFIni definitely enjoys sports. I was one of the last grandchildren in a long line of grandkids. Everyone else had largely outgrown my grandmother's company. My grandmother indulged me in ways that aligned with my interest. And the story I'm going to tell you, at this young stage in my life, I had a passion for baseball cards. Topps baseball cards, to be exact. I still have boxes of Topps baseball cards in my possession. It was one of the ways that if you are a baseball collector, and before we really understood the value of these things, you would really have a stack of baseball cards in your hand that you would go through, would even stick them in their bikes and made a great noise. It probably was not the smartest thing to do from a value proposition, but they were cardboard and we didn't really understand that. So I have a lot of great memories with baseball cards. It allowed me to memorize statistics on the back of the card. It helped my organizational skills in terms of sorting them by team, and occasionally you'd get these checklist cards. People back then did not understand that the checklist cards actually had probably some greater value in a sense than some of the actual player cards. But I digress. So even on a fixed income, of Social Security, my grandmother could afford a pack or two of baseball cards when it was in the middle of the season. Usually that the baseball cards would come out about April, in line with the start of the baseball season. Living during the Great Depression, my grandmother definitely knew how to stretch a dollar. My grandmother's frugal practices were born of necessity, not necessarily by her choosing. Financial independence, or as many call it, FI, the FIRE movement, which is financial independence, retire early, was not a term in my grandmother's era. It was simply survival. The thought of retirement, let alone an early retirement, was not a concept that resonated with individuals from that era, particularly those that lived during the Great Depression and really struggled just for their daily survival. However, when my grandmother could do something special for me, she was more than willing. And we were really great buddies. I could tell you many stories about my grandmother, and I probably will in the future beyond this. In particular, my grandmother had careful money management. Certainly the Great Depression influenced it, but there was an even bigger issue, if you can believe that, beyond the Great Depression that impacted the way that my grandmother approached her finances. It's because my grandfather had passed away long before I was born. By all accounts, anyone I knew that knew my grandfather said he was an incredible man, a saintly man. I could go into stories about that, even though I never met him. He really was a genuine individual, not probably very good with money. He was incredibly generous, the type of person that would literally give you the shirt off his back or whatever he had around. Again, even though he too lived through the Great Depression, didn't have a lot, but was just one of those people that was willing to make those sacrifices. I was so aware of my grandfather's presence in all of these stories because my grandmother constantly talked about my grandfather. That's not surprising. She certainly missed him so much. Again, he was sort of this larger than life figure, at least in my perception of him. And one of the reasons I was aware of money, even at a very early age, was due to my grandmother's financial situation. I was a confidant for my grandmother. And again, I was around her more than my other cousins had been, because other people would get busy and I was one of the last people in this long line of grandkids. So we hung out a lot. My grandmother had explained to me on a regular basis that my grandfather's unexpected death at a young age occurred 1 month or so before she would have been eligible for Social Security. Originally, I didn't know what Social Security was, but I knew it was a very valuable thing. And I knew this was particularly true if you were a widow. Now, Social Security, if you know anything about the history of Social Security, you know that by design, originally, very few people were going to actually be eligible for it because the life expectancy was typically less than age 65. And my grandfather passed away much earlier than that. So if you have listened to this show before, you know that we have a 2-part financial independence number or 2-part FI number. If you have not listened to those shows, I would encourage you to go back and listen to episode number 3, which details how we came upon our personal determination of a 2-part FI number or financial independence number, and episode 4, which gives you a moment in time where we are in terms of our 2-part FI number strategy. Our part 1, which is from age 59 and a half to age 65, and then our part 2 FI number, which is based on age 65 and beyond. So I encourage you to go and listen to those 2 episodes to learn more about that. I, again, will reiterate that my grandmother could not have imagined a 2-part FI number. She could not have imagined that we would be pursuing this type of strategy as part of our family FI. And I know that my grandmother would be very proud that I was actively planning for my retirement, because this was not something that you were able to do back in the day. It was a great source of stress for her, and I think she would feel very good about the fact that her difficult situation had an impact on me in terms of planning for this. Again, retirement really was not a thing back in the day. Most people never got to collect their Social Security because, like my grandfather, they died before they had the chance to retire at age 65. As an early widow in her 50s, my grandmother was not financially secure. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, had been small business owners, and my grandfather did not have a pension. So, like most people in my grandparents' era, if they had a job, say a factory job, or worked for a company, the pension plan was the typical retirement plan. My paternal grandfather did have a pension. He lived well beyond the age of 65, and I will certainly talk about my grandfather more in future episodes. He too influenced my financial thinking, and if you have not listened to the episode in terms of my own father and his financial cluelessness, which we released before this episode, please do so. So, like many people, my grandparents on my maternal side considered Social Security as their retirement plan. And they're not alone in that, even to this day, because many people rely upon Social Security as their sole source of income. No Social Security and retirement is not an option. So for my grandmother's options for retirement were not good, as she did not receive Social Security. Instead, my grandmother went back into the workforce, and I knew this was rare because my mom and my aunts did not work. None of the moms in my neighborhood worked either. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood. We probably were one of the families with the lowest income in that middle-class neighborhood. Here I had my grandmother working and my mom not working. Definitely not at the time. Later on, my mom did some part-time work, but I was not a latchkey kid as was known back in the day. My grandmother worked for a very well-known national company. Indeed, it's a company that if you heard the name even today, many people would know this company. Indeed, my grandmother was very proud of working for this company. My grandmother didn't like to drive. She had a state-issued ID card, not a driver's license per se that allowed you to drive. She would describe traveling on the bus and working with all of her new friends from work as an adventure. My grandmother was convincing that this was such a great thing to be working, despite what was, to say the least, a difficult situation. At this point in my life, again, I was very young. I only saw my grandmother on weekends because she worked Monday through Friday. And typically I had school Monday through Friday. And if it was summer, she maybe occasionally would take a day off of work in summer to spend time with me, or I would go see her for the weekend. One other, I call it a memory, but it's really a series of memories because it is affiliated with this one toy. There is a version of it now, but the original Fisher Price corn popper toy, if you are from a certain era, you will remember this. And it was a toy that I just loved, But let me switch back a little bit. Let me switch gears a little bit here in terms of my grandmother. So eventually my grandmother earned the right to Social Security and retirement. As such, she believed she could just barely afford to retire. Money was always tight for my grandmother, and I knew this because, again, she confided in me. I was very young, and, she needed someone to speak with, and I was usually the individual that was closest around. She probably didn't actually realize that I was picking up all these lessons and all of these clues about money from the conversation. She needed an outlet. Like I was like a audio version of a diary, I guess is how I would describe it in some sense. It was about this time that my grandmother sold her house and moved into an apartment. And this was a very big deal. It was not a nursing home. It was not even a transition to have apartment and then other forms of care as people progress. But the thing about her moving is that this meant that my beloved, what I called Grandma's house, Fisher Price corn popper push toy with the wooden handle was going away too. If you were like me, again, I was a very high energy kid. I used to run all around my grandmother's house pushing the corn popper toy for hours. Probably, and it made this noise like corn popping in a pan, the way the old school corn popping went. Her house wasn't that big, but I would push that thing from the family room through the hallways to the kitchen, the bedrooms, all over the place, just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So that is probably a story that I could go into greater detail at another point. Thankfully, my grandmother would just let me run around all over the place with that corn popper toy. I really was too tall by the time she sold her house to utilize that corn popper toy. It was going to be given away to one of her friends who had younger grandchildren. Something that I recall that in that move, the Fisher Price corn popper toy went away as well. Now, my grandmother did influence me another way for my lifetime because she emphasized experiences over material possessions. My grandmother also lived in the city instead of the suburbs. I, at that young age, understood that the city had a faster paced vibe and there were all different types of people, all different types of socioeconomics, your different races, different religions. I couldn't have necessarily described it to you in those terms, but I just knew that the city had a different vibe. The other thing about the city was there was always an air of adventure, which was partially driven by my grandmother's personality, but also due to the environment. As much as I liked going to my grandmother's house with a corn popper toy, her apartment building had a cast of characters and adventure. As much as I liked going to my grandmother's house with the corn popper toy, her apartment had a cast of characters and adventure. I love playing in endless card games and apartment bingo competitions. These visits also meant playing 33s and 45s on her portable record player and singing Elvis songs. Today we know those things as vinyl records, which are back in style. I was also fond of eating breakfast for dinner, such as toast and bacon. There was no order of the day in which food needed to be eaten, and that suited me just fine. My grandmother was practicing the art of the best things in life are free lifestyle. On one particular visit, my grandmother needed to renew a medicine, and this meant walking to the local Walgreens about a mile away. As was typically the case, I asked my grandmother if she would buy me a pack of baseball cards as part of the trip. My grandmother was not one to shower me with gifts. Instead, she had an incredible influence on my going for experiences. In this instance, my grandmother hesitated as she fumbled with her coin purse. My grandmother was stressed on the walk over, realizing she only had $1 and change. It quickly became clear that she did not have the money for baseball cards, nor did she likely have the money for her medicine. Now, this was because, like many, Social Security was her sole source of income. I knew that her Social Security check was not due for several more days. I was also aware that the closer in the month that got towards the next Social Security check, the tighter money got. Scary side note, as of a 2020 report from the National Institute on Retirement Security, and I'm not sure that this is a legit thing, but it seems to be, 40% of older Americans rely on Social Security income solely. Their sole source of income is Social Security. And there's a report that came out recently that said Social Security benefits will be cut. In essence, because there's not enough money right now in those entitlement accounts. Always one to downplay difficult circumstances, my grandmother offered, "Today we're going to play a little game before we go into the store. We're going to look in the parking lot for all the spare change we can find." I remember that it was probably April because the new baseball cards were being released, and I barely had any packs yet. My parents were typically good for 2 packs on the first day the car hit the stores in our area. This has something to do with finding money when you are looking for it. The Walgreens was part of a large strip mall. I, of course, took this task with competitive vengeance, as if willing a pack of baseball cards. Shortly thereafter, I discovered a quarter in the parking lot. A quarter was almost enough buying power for a McDonald's hamburger, or at least half the cost back in those days, as best I can recall. My grandmother beamed in response. I am confident she was praying a string of Hail Marys as we walked between every car in the parking lot. Soon I was finding pennies, nickels, and dimes with regularity as I dashed between the cars, quicker than my grandmother could keep up with me. Then miraculously, in the lava rock concrete parking space planter barrier, I found a $5 bill and a bunch of loose change. If I didn't know any better, I would have sworn that the money was purposely dropped there, like an Easter egg hunt without the plastic eggs. $5 was a ton of money back in those days. It was also a lesson for later in life that you can find money in all sorts of places if you're focused on looking for it. This includes watching your expenses decrease as consciousness grows faster than inflation. And we have more on that in another episode. So the indelible Social Security baseball card memory. By the time I finished combing through every inch of that strip mall parking lot, we had tons of money. At least by little kid standards, we had tons of money for shopping. Indeed, stuffing the front and back pockets of my Toughskins jeans full of change. I have a distinct memory of sitting on the curb by the Walgreens counting out all the coins with my grandmother. After the first round of counting, my grandmother began crying silently with tears streaming down her face. My grandmother was composing herself and insisting we count all the money again. My grandmother had a 6th grade education, but was well educated in street smarts. I was not that old, but I knew a nickel was worth 5 pennies and $1 worth 100 pennies. Carefully counting together once again, we confirmed we had over $12. HouFIni understands that $12 more than likely seems like an enormously small amount of money today. However, back when I was a little kid, that $12 was the equivalent of around $70 today. My grandmother's tears were flowing even harder down her face upon this confirmation. This part of the memory is a little fuzzy, but I seem to recall that my grandmother's monthly Social Security check was about $250 a month. To my knowledge, this was her only source of income. I'm not sure how much my grandmother's apartment was each month. However, as an adult, I learned she was living in fixed income senior housing. Admittedly, my grandmother probably had some money from the sale of her house, but not much. As I do the quick math now, $250 divided by 30 days means my grandmother had about $8.34 every day to live on in total. So over $12 was equal to about a day and a half. And that's not counting whatever she had to deduct each day to pay for rent, which was probably close to the amount of time she needed to get to her next monthly Social Security check. Gratitude in all things, even baseball cards. As I was trying to comfort my grandmother, she said one of her regular phrases, "How great thou art." Intuitively, I knew my grandmother's comment was not directed at me. My grandmother was praising God from her favorite song at Mass, "How great thou art." My grandmother indicated that we were going to go inside and wash our hands from picking up all that money. She explained that we would be buying special things today, including 4 packs of Topps baseball cards. Indeed, this was a very special day. Even on outings when I was very good, it was a 2-pack of baseball card day. It was such moments. My grandmother was teaching me, by example, her gratitude for the little things in life. At that moment, my abundant life included praising the gift of baseball cards. Accordingly, a whopping 4 packs of Topps baseball cards, which is why the memory really sticks with me, because it was so unusual to get that amount of cards at one time. But there was more. It really was the shopping trip of a lifetime. It's amazing how luxurious over $12 feels. Actually, $14 since our counting did not include the dollar and change my grandmother arrived with for this trip. After washing all the loose found change in the bathroom, we set off for shopping. After getting my grandmother's medicine, which we paid for at the back counter in coins, she said we could shop. Instinctively, I was racing over to the baseball card aisle. As a kid, I did not just pick any packs. Typically, the sticky material on the back of at least a few baseball card packs was a little loose. If you collected cards back in the day, you know what I mean. As such, the wax paper flap and the stick of gum could give you an idea of which player was on the first card. I was always trying to be strategic to get a player I liked or a card I did not have yet. Further, if you were lucky enough to get an all-star card or a rookie card in the first card, I was definitely seeking that pack. Of course, I took time to go through the bigger open box as I was selecting my 4 precious packs of Topps baseball cards. Literally, I went through every pack of cards to see which 4 packs would be the best value or the most interesting, to the extent that I could use my little cheat sheet or cheat code to select my packs. Once I had my packs, it was more extravagance in necessities. And that's what I mean, extravagance in necessities, right? So we had already purchased my grandmother's medicine, which was a necessity. Now, my baseball cards weren't really a necessity, but I'm not sure I would have seen it that way back then. My grandmother and I carefully walked up and down the food aisles. I was a finicky eater, so picking out food was a big deal. I think we finally settled on a pack of Oscar Mayer bologna, a dozen eggs, a loaf of Wonder Bread, a packet of lemonade Kool-Aid, and marmalade jelly. We selected the marmalade jelly after coaxing my grandmother to pick out a special occasion treat for herself. Accordingly, a lifelong lesson is that finding extravagance in necessities is one way to live an abundant life. My grandmother could have bought the regular grape jelly for her toast, and she would have been perfectly fine with grape jelly. In fact, most days, my grandmother was living intentionally denying herself these simple pleasures. However, for pennies on the dollar, my grandmother was finding extravagance in necessities by allowing herself the marmalade jelly. These marginal differences may be yielding enormous psychological return on investment. HouFIni asked, how can you be living your grape jelly versus marmalade jelly moment only for a few cents or dollars more? HouFIni says it's time to define your psychological return on investment or your emotional return on investment. Those seeking to achieve financial freedom know that return on investment, or ROI, is an important tool. HouFIni believes psychological ROI or emotional ROI may provide bigger life returns than your financial ROI in some ways. Even after my grandmother and I carefully made our selections, we ended up spending less than half the money we found. I remember this because, again, we were counting out all the change on the counter. We never spent any of the hard cash dollars while shopping. A $5 bill, again, a $5 bill was a big deal back then, at least to a young kid. The neat thing is this story becomes more powerful in the retelling. I'm definitely not one to enjoy shopping. However, this shopping trip is worth remembering. In fact, my grandmother would later retell this story many a time in my presence. Further, my grandmother would encourage me to tell the story, including coming home and washing my Toughskins jeans in the tub and letting them hang dry while I hung out in my pajamas. My grandmother did not have a washer and dryer in her apartment. Washing and drying clothes meant you had to have the change for these tasks. Plus, it was a long walk down to the basement where the washer and dryers were in my grandmother's apartment building. Instead, my grandmother was old school, and washing clothes in the bathtub was what she did to make do. Once clothes were washed, hanging them on a hanger on the shower rod is what you did. Ironing stiff, drying clothes is what you did to soften the clothes up. My Toughskins jeans always had extra patches over the knees, so the knees were never soft. However, I was a big fan of wearing my Toughskins. As a kid, I lived in hand-me-down Toughskins jeans. Talk about ROI. Making the coin search a regular practice. As a result of being in desperate need of money on that trip to Walgreens, my grandmother made a new game. Thereafter, my grandmother and I regularly made every trip somewhere a search for treasure. We became so adept at our adventuring that we regularly added special treats like marmalade to our visits. We never ended up finding quite as much money as we did on our initial treasure hunt. However, our Social Security and retirement and baseball card adventuring left an indelible money memory. Happy treasure hunting at fires. So thanks for being with us today on Retirement Police Most Wanted. We hope you will continue your treasure hunting. We'd love to hear what your adventures are. Until then, good luck. Continue to figure out how you're going to plan your escape and break your golden handcuffs and escape the retirement police. Be well.